I'm mad because players are throwing away $1 million futures over $1 decisions.
Welcome into College Football Today. He's Carl Reed. I'm Emily Proud. We are so glad you decided to join us today. We got an awesome show in store. As always, though, be sure to subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. That's the only way that you can be a part of the chat. Already see some people with some comments, some questions, some concerns, I'd say, in the chat right now. So be sure you are subscribed to be a part of that. Also, hit that like button so we know that you are watching. But Carl, I want to go back to why you are mad today. I know that we've been hearing a lot about it in the news recently, but in your estimation, has it gotten worse? And if so, why?
Well, guys have to make better decisions, Emily. When you play football or basketball at a place like the University of Alabama, you're going to be held to a higher standard of decision making. And what a lot of guys need to understand is the skill set that it takes for you maybe to survive back home where you're from is not the same skills needed to achieve and survive on a college campus. And so when you consistently put yourself in situations where you're making poor decisions, you're just costing yourself so much. You're costing yourself an opportunity at an education, maybe at an opportunity of playing sports professionally. You're costing yourself an opportunity at getting gainful employment down the road when you have all these arrests and different issues, on your background checks. Guys just aren't thinking. It's really hard for young men sometimes to separate themselves from the guys they grew up with, but they also have to take accountability because they may be the guys that people need to separate themselves from.
I say it all the time. If you need help, if you need guidance, call the coach. Call Coach Carl Reed, and he will direct you down the right path. I'm not going to give out your phone number, though. Got a great comment here from Joe Bro saying, I'm mad because Carl is always mad. He's not mad. Look at him. He's smiling here. He's excited about today's show. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest joining us on the show today, but we got to talk about this resume because it is lengthy. Marc Isenberg is the author of a book called Money Players and the Student Athlete Survival Guide. He also served as an expert witness against the NCAA in the Rick Neuheisel case. Marc also hosts a podcast called the Power Check Ball Podcast, and he is currently teaching the NIL experience at the USC Annenberg School. So let's go ahead and welcome Marc into the program today. Marc, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you two today.
Yes.
A lot to talk about.
So much to talk about. Yeah, especially in that NIL space. We ran through the resume. You're very active when it comes to NIL. So first and foremost, where does that passion for NIL education come from?
That's a good question. I don't even know if I'm passionate about NIL per se, as much as I am the fact that NIL is literally the only avenue by which college athletes currently can receive financial benefits for their athletic abilities. So, just the whole concept of making sure that athletes understand the world that they inhabit, how can we help them take advantage of the opportunities and avoid the dangers?
Marc, when I look at it, the Money Players book that you wrote years ago, I saw it for the first time. I think it was '09. My brother's agent gave it to him right before he went to play professional basketball. I've given that book to every athlete that has played for me that's went on to the college and professional level since 2009. And so when I hearing that you're teaching at USC or knowing that about NIL, what are some of the things that you think that guys have got to know when you write books like the Money Players, when you're teaching these classes? What's the basis of some of the fundamental things that these athletes need to know moving forward with their careers financially?
I think that the general concept that this business is not that complicated. If it is, it's by design. It's because the schools, the agents, financial advisors. They want to keep athletes in the dark. They don't want them to know. They want them to be dependent on them as the source of information. They don't want them questioning too many things, because once you sort of go inside the proverbial sausage factory, you don't want to eat the sausages. And so, to the extent that athletes have access to better information, in my opinion, it's not a big leap from what we're saying and why it's in their best interest. So we really just want to make sure that they ask the right questions, that they're making the transition from high school to college, that they're asking the coaches what's going on, how they're going to be treated athletically, academically. So just the whole concept of, in the past, it was like, okay, you focus on your sport, we'll take care of the rest. Trust us. Unfortunately, we've seen that is an absolute formula for disaster. So I think that the new version of athlete empowerment is they need to understand the world that they inhabit, and they need to ask questions, and they need to hold people accountable, whether it's their own family members, whether it's their high school coaches, college coaches, agents, and just the whole concept of being involved. This business, there's still enough time in the day to focus on your sport, on your schoolwork. You can play, Nintendo. You can watch YouTube videos, and you now, at least, if you want to engage in NIL, you have that opportunity as well.
You mentioned the importance of education and the fact that you do teach this course to student athletes, but I'm sure that you still have a lot of question marks yourself about NIL. I mean, we talk about just how different it is from state to state. There's all these court cases that are continually going on. There's the high school ranks versus the college. I mean, there's still a lot to be worked out. And I love the phrasing that you use, and that this iteration is called NIL 1.0. So what have we learned in our, just over a year of having NIL in the space?
I guess that could be the final question, but cut me off if I start to run on too long. I tell people, NIL 1.0 is so much better than the previous system that had cut athletes' ability to earn money off at zero. And so now the NCAA comes along and says, okay, you can benefit from your name, image, and likeness, but we're going to take all the great meat off the bone, which is the television revenue, the shoe deals, and we're going to say, you athletes, go hustle for whatever scraps might be left over. So what we found is, that the NCAA has created a system that sort of puts us back into almost this underground economy, although now we're calling it collectives, because the NCAA does not want their member institutions engaging directly in name, image, and likeness. So they said, okay, we're not going to allow this to be used as pay for play. We're not going to let this be used as an inducement to sign. They're going to have to go out in the marketplace and figure out what is available. So now we have third-party marketplaces that you can go online and create relationships with brands, and the idea that they're going to pay you. It might work. It sounds good in theory, but what we find is that brands do not necessarily want to attach to athletes that they don't have a one-on-one relationship with, that there's a lot of due diligence along the way. And so there's a lot going on here that it sounds great. I'm excited. I think that the NCAA, their version was, we are going to block NIL at every opportunity. And then when it came about, because of the states that were passing NIL bills, the Alston case, and they realized that they couldn't hold the line anymore. And we just really didn't have a reasonable way to roll it out in a more organized fashion. Although I don't know if the NCAA in its current iteration has any kind of DNA that's built for partnering with athletes and bringing them to the negotiating table and figuring out what might be a fair representation of the value that they're bringing to the table.
Now, Mark, a lot of fans, a lot of old school people will say, but the kids are getting a scholarship. Why is a scholarship not enough for the athlete?
I don't think we could say blanket that an athletic scholarship is not enough. for all athletes. I think for 95%, 97%, I'm just picking up numbers, it probably is a square deal. So we're not saying that athletes deserve more because they're all generating revenue, and then the counter argument was, well, that would bankrupt us. All we're saying is those athletes who have market value in excess of their athletic scholarship, full cost of attendance, stipends that some of them are now receiving, that they should have the ability to go and find out what is available. And if they get paid $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, in some cases, 7 figures, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's all about the opportunity. We're watching some commercials right now that student athletes were able to do. And as you said, it is the opportunity to find what your market value is and to be able to capitalize on that. So who does or who should be able to determine the value of an individual student athlete?
I mean, I don't think I'm by nature a libertarian or just want to come and say, oh, the marketplace should figure all of that out. But in some ways, that would be a nice representation of what an athlete is worth to a brand, a collective, and we could certainly delve deeper into the pluses and minuses of collectives in terms of just their first iteration. But I really think that we would be much better off if we had some light regulations to make sure that everybody's interests are protected. The institution, they don't want necessarily a free-for-all. They don't want them signing with brands that will not make the athlete look good, the institution. I certainly want to make sure that athletes aren't being exploited by brands because they're not being given good deals, that the terms are such that they're giving away too many rights. And what's unfortunate sometimes is you have people who come into this space and say, okay, I'm an NIL expert. I don't know. I mean, I hope that in the Chiron that I wasn't listed as an NIL expert. I don't know who is one at this point. The reality is that there are people who can certainly support athletes with legal abilities, with an understanding of how brand partnerships operate. But at the same time, this becomes the Wild West, that there's no barriers of entry and that there's very little regulation around who's working with athletes. And so, I mean, again, I think this is a better problem than the past version, which was agents are going to be demonized. We're going to pass state laws, and I think 42 states was the Uniform Athlete Agent Act that really restricted the athlete's ability to get fair and competent representation. Then they want to make sure that they're all registered, and then they tried that, and then we had the Rich Paul rule where he was unfairly singled out because he was not a college graduate. And then you would argue that he has a real opportunity to make an impact in the lives of athletes because he is working with a lot of high-level NBA players. So again, I think that the more the NCAA took this paternalistic view that they knew what was best, and they restricted the communication between athlete and agents, it really almost had this self-defeating purpose, and we didn't necessarily end up with a better place when we had the version of the no agent rule that would prohibit athletes from signing with agents. And now we went from that rule to now you can have agents, and who are the good ones? Who are the ones that are going to provide ethical representation? And we don't have a long track record to determine who the good guys and who are the bad guys.
Mark, we had a situation in recruiting this year, and I guess it's happening quite a bit, where the numbers are getting really big for some of the guys coming out of high school. Jaden Rashada was signed to the University of Florida, and something fell apart with this NIL deal right before he was supposed to head out and go. In your opinion, Mark, what was the breakdown in the Jaden Rashada situation?
I think this is just another example where the NCAA does not allow the schools to be directly involved. You have these collectives that popped up because all the things that might have been taking place in the underground economy prior to NIL can now be done above board. But certainly when you sort of really tie everybody's hands behind their back and saying, sort of the two overarching themes of NIL is that you cannot have an inducement to sign and you can't have pay for play. So if you're a lawyer that's representing the athlete, you would want to make sure that that was very specific in the contracts. And then meanwhile, the collectives, they have really kind of misaligned interests because they want to make sure that they're getting the best athletes, but they don't want to run afoul of NCAA rules and jeopardize the institution itself. So I was not, I've not read Jaden's contract that he had with Florida, but I would imagine that it wasn't worth the paper that it was printed on because they didn't make good on what was allegedly promised to him. And then, that led to, him transferring or moving over to Arizona State. And again, I think that, we would want to have, if I was sort of looking through the lens of the college athlete, the ability to be very specific of why he's being paid, what legal rights that athlete has if they do not comply with the terms of the agreement. But again, this is so new that it's very difficult to hold people accountable.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned earlier all the lawsuits that are going on. You mentioned the Alston case, of course, the Supreme Court really saying, come at me if you want to try some more NCAA cases. We are happy to hear. But there actually is one going on right now in the Johnson versus the NCAA case. They're of course trying to say that athletes can be viewed as employees, not necessarily meaning that they would be, but there is the opportunity for them to. So as you're kind of tracking this case, what would college athletes look like as employees?
And I think that there's been a lot of scare tactics that you don't want to go there because this is going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And so it really is, this is before my time, but 50, 60 years ago when there was a fight for free agency in Major League Baseball, they had polled the players, and I think it was like 55% of all MLB players at that time did not want to end the reserve clause that would bring us free agency because they were so conditioned to believing that that would destroy the stability of the product. And certainly in the 50 years since the advent of free agency, we realized that everything that the Major League Baseball owners at the time were putting out through the media, that they were putting out, to the players, turned out not to be true. So I think that we're back to a lot of the same arguments that the NCAA has used, that if athletes are converted into employees, that it will run afoul of Title IX. It will create a mechanism by which the NCAA won't be able to deal with all the tax implications. The fans will turn off. So it's just like on and on. I sort of take the view of, I'm not sure if the whole idea of converting athletes into employees is the absolute solution. I sort of just want to come up with a mechanism by which we could put athletes at the bargaining table where they have the ability to make sure that their interests are protected. And if that's through labor laws, that's fine. If that's through some other vehicle that recognizes that athletes play an important role in certainly the sports that generate a lot of revenue, then they need to be adequately represented, whether it's individual rights through one agent protecting their legal and financial interests, or collectively, probably by sport.
Mark, one of the fights that we have when we talk about our athletes, employees, comes to, we paint a broad brush. Sometimes we talk about revenue sports versus non-revenue sports. Is it any way for us to differentiate what the guys that are in revenue sport producing sports get versus the players who are not in revenue sports. And to me, it's not as easy as men and women because when you think about UConn women's basketball, South Carolina and Tennessee women's basketball, they do produce revenue as well. And so I don't know that everybody produces it like that, but there are some women's programs that produce revenue. Is there any way for us to differentiate and maybe classify the revenue versus the non-revenue athletes at a school in different categories so we can better handle it?
I mean, that's a great question. I guess the first part would be that women's basketball, and there's so many emerging sports that were kept down because all of the attention, all the money, all the marketing dollars flowed to certain sports. And now, I mean, sort of going back to we're in March Madness, and it was only a male terminology to use March Madness, and now you realize just what will happen over the next 10, 20 years if we invest in women's sports. So I think as far as the classification, I don't know if we necessarily have to define it by college sports and which one that they're specifically playing. I think in many ways it should be an institutional determination. What's interesting is, and I've said this on my podcast and in other areas, I'm not even sure why schools have to federate by school, that they have to be Division I for all, across the board. That in many ways that they would be better off if they want to compete at the highest level, that they know that there's a cost associated with it and that there's value to be had if you can participate at that level, but that they don't necessarily have to do that across the board. So I don't know. I mean, these things are, I don't want to say above my pay grade. I mean, I think that what ends up happening is we sort of talk our way out of this, and the default for the NCAA is, oh, we can't do anything. It's too complex. I mean, we have complex problems in this world that we have to solve. And so I think the NCAA has bet on the whole concept of there's 500,000. I always hate to use the term student athlete, but that's like a whole nother conversation. But that they're all going to go, that 98% of them are going to go pro in something other than their sport, and so that we can create all these rules for the other 98%. And too bad for the others that play a role in generating hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And so, I think that these issues aren't as complex as people are making them out to be. If you help generate revenue in an industry, that there should be some fair representation of what that value is. And there should be a way through individual and collective marketing that we determine what might be fair.
Yeah, I've personal experience with this issue. I played soccer in college, so a very highly revenue-generating sport that is women's soccer, and so I do recognize that there are going to be the inequities, and that kind of begs the question, how realistic is it to expect there to be full equality, and is that a reason to not do something just because you can't figure it out?
I mean, that's a great question, because I think that, again, one of these other silly arguments that the NCAA put forth of why we shouldn't have NIL is the fact that all the money is going to flow to certain athletes. Now we're a year and a half into NIL. We realized that this was a fundamental right that in the hands of somebody that is creative and that has this platform, if they're a non-revenue producing athlete, that they can compete with anybody else if they have the ability to stand in front of the camera and create compelling content. And we've seen some of the stars, probably more of the stars that we have associated through NIL are the female athletes that really have an unbelievable platform to engage in beauty products, athletic wear, and then that to me would be true NIL, as opposed to that version that the NCAA doesn't want to term it, but that's pay for play. And we're talking about the football players, basketball players that operate through the collective as their mechanism to get compensated.
Mark, you're a big time recruit. You get $1 million NIL deal. What happens when you don't produce and you go to school and you average 6 points a game?
Well, I mean, if you watch the press conference with Rick Pitino, and if you were getting paid $0, you realize that your job is still on the line. So just the fact that there's more money involved, I think that the schools are going to try to figure out ways that if somebody's not producing and they're taking one of the valued scholarships, that there's going to be an effort to make that athlete's life. I don't know if it's miserable or if you can sell them on the idea that they might be better off at another institution. I think the other point with brands that are offering $1 million, the hope would be that they're sophisticated enough to have an algorithm that determines why that athlete is worth it, knowing that there is the risk of transferring. And at some point, I always felt like that NIL can solve some problems with I never like to term it the transfer problem because I don't know if anybody realizes, but athletes transfer at a lower rate than the general student population. The only difference is there's no pissed off coach that is going to his press conference and complaining and creating this narrative that there's this transfer epidemic. So NIL, if we can give them an opportunity to create multi-year NIL deals, then there might be a barrier in place that would make it more difficult. I think that the NCAA has always run into that whole concept of they wanted their cake and eat it too, so that they had in the past with we're dealing with the NIL and now with the NLI, the National Letter of Intent. And so that was basically saying that you were bound to the school for 1 year, and then if you transferred, that the school would have the ability to restrict it, and then you would have to sit out a year. If you wanted to transfer within the conference, you would have to sit out a year, and they dock you a year of eligibility. So that didn't work, not because the NCAA wouldn't want to have their cake and eat it too, but pretty much because of the fact that the NCAA was back that whole argument that athletes are students, not employees. And if they are in fact students, then they should have the same right to transfer. So they kind of created this mess, and we have to allow them to transfer freely, unlike they were in the past. So I would like to see, I don't know if I'm waving my magic wand, but I recognize that these schools are investing in these athletes on a level that's far beyond what the general student population gets. And if we can create stability and we can create economic incentives to keep them there multiple years, I think that would be a good thing. If they're not producing, then it's in everybody's best interest to figure out a better environment, whether that's through a transfer or, just looking at this through the lens of the athlete. If they're run off the program, they should still get their scholarship for a certain number of years. And, the school should have to write off that as a bad mistake. When you are drafting in the NFL or NBA, there's no do-overs. You have to eat that pick, and you have to pay the player out what they were guaranteed, and you move on.
I love that you mentioned the NLI part of it, because that sometimes gets forgotten, right? Even here at 24/7 Sports, we love signing day. I think we have an actual quota we have to hit to say the phrase pen to paper and signing on the dotted line and all those fun things. But then there's the question of what are they actually signing and what are the restrictions that they see with those NLIs. And I think that's what, the Johnson side of the case is arguing, is it's less about money. Everybody wants to say that, employees mean salaries, right? Being an employee also means that there's a certain amount of control that comes from your employer. And so what needs to be fixed when it comes to the control element of student athletes potentially becoming employees?
I have been writing about the National Letter of Intent for so long, in fact, that I think my wife, who's a sports attorney and now sports agent. I think before we were married, so I mean, we're on 16, 17 years. I should have known the exact year. But so now I was reading her the terms of the national letter of intent, and she had responded. She's like, that's a contract of adhesion. What's a contract of adhesion? I had no idea. And so she's like, when the terms are so one-sided that if you ever put this in front of a judge, that they would rule it an unenforceable contract. That there's really, other than the guarantee of a one-year scholarship, it's not necessarily what it's cracked up to be. Back, I think in this up until 1972, scholarships were actually 4-year guaranteed contracts. Now, their schools are actually, I think, as of 2011 or 2012, schools are now allowed to offer multi-year scholarships, but they have not been transparent about, in fact, this is a 4-year guaranteed, no cut. Certainly you have to perform in the classroom. You can't be bringing guns to situations that could lead to really bad results. So there would be some level of expectation that they would acquit themselves in a very positive light, that they would be academically eligible. I think it just kind of comes back to the idea that if we want to sign them to contracts, then there has to be the other side of that, which is something more than a scholarship. That obviously you see some value in locking this athlete up, and at that point the question is, what else should you offer that would be an economic incentive to come to the school and a fair representation of the value that they're creating.
Got a YouTube question here. As a reminder, if you're enjoying this conversation as much as we are, go ahead and smash that like button. This is a comment here from Joe Bro saying, being an employee means unions and more benefits. So along those same lines, we know the NCAA loves to keep their stance of they are amateurs because they always have been amateurs. But Mark, if that goes away and we move into this future iteration of the NCAA, I mean, what is that governing body's role then if student athletes become employees?
Well, I don't know. The whole concept of athletes getting more rights is a good thing. That this is something that we should be fighting for. I think back in the day, going back 100 years ago, employees in general were just completely mistreated by employers. They were taken advantage of, and I don't know if there was some beer commercial that had some tagline of, this weekend brought to you by Michelob. I don't know which one it was, but the whole concept of worker protections is ingrained in our country for centuries. Unfortunately, without getting into a political discussion, unions have become a bad word. That they are now being undercut because of just sort of this paternalistic view that unions are corrupt, that unions are asking for too much, and they're stifling growth, and you could do better without it. But again, that's sort of that leap that you'll have to trust the employer to fairly determine what is the level of compensation, the level of insurance. And again, we've seen a lot of these cases come out of the fact that athletes are really exposed in many of these areas, particularly in the sports that come with very real health risks.
Mark, a question that I have for you is, when we talk about the NCAA and the future role of it, can college sports survive without the NCAA? Do we even need that governing body, or is it something, could the conferences operate themselves? What would be the move if we didn't have the NCAA?
I always say, I don't have a crystal ball, but these kind of questions require that I have to sort of predict. So look, I tell people I believe in amateur sports. I played it. It's called Division III. I think the NCAA does a very good job of creating and organizing championships. And I think that there is a role that they can continue to play. But what role do they play in college football? So I think that they're struggling to figure out what their relevance is. they are relevant because they operate all these championships. They have the enforcement arm that gives them the power. They also have the whole concept of what holds NCAA sports together is that there's 1,100 plus members that believe that they do better as a voluntary association, and that they work in unison. And I think that, I mean, that sounds good on paper. I think that the way it's played out over the last 20 years, as we saw a conference alignment, as we've seen just unimpeded capitalism on the revenue side, there's no honor among thieves. That, I mean, I've had conversations with athletic directors when I would bring up, why can't you do X, Y, and Z that would better accomplish taking care of athletes in a way that I would think would be fair? They would always come back to traditions, that they're students, not employees. It's almost like a wind-up doll. They have all of their arguments ready to go, but then their country club memberships, their multi-million-dollar salaries are all brought to you by the fact that this business generates hundreds of millions of dollars, and their cost of labor, other than maybe one high-priced coach. And now I guess, and it's a good thing that some of the salaries are trickling down to the assistant coaches, the strength and conditioning. But when we come to the whole discussion of athletes, there's this tradition of amateurism. And I think that what's nice about the world we live in today, the idea that for 115 years, the NCAA had this almost unbeatable record in the courts. They had Congress on their side. They had the public. Because again, remember, they had a bankroll. Anytime a lawsuit came along that challenged amateurism, they were ready to fight it. Anytime they needed to change the public perception throughout the NCAA tournament, they could just run their PSAs and all. We put our money where our mouth is, or we put our money where our mission is. And so, I mean, it's just on and on. At some point, it worked until it didn't. It didn't when we had the O'Bannon case. Then we had the Alston case. And now we've got another one that is going through the court system, and we'll answer some questions. But I think if anything, it creates a captive audience that the NCAA knows that they're fighting for survival, and we'll see ultimately where this falls. I think that they're sort of putting all of their chips on some form of a federal bill that will bring some order to the chaos. How much time do we have? That's like
I got one more question for you, Marc. I got one more question, and it's probably the most important question here. So as we're dealing with the new age of NIL and the NCAA figuring out its place and potentially losing some of its control and some of its power, who is advocating on behalf of the student athlete?
And I think that the NCAA always benefited from the fact that it was always a moving target. 22 years ago, there was something called the Student Basketball Committee that was co-headed by Shane Battier and Mark Madsen. They went to the Final Four. Actually, I sat in on some of the meetings. I was fortunate enough that I would give them some of my input. And they were masterful. They wanted to advocate for college basketball players. They had a press conference. Shane Battier played at Duke, had an amazing career in the NBA. And, he sat up there and really was a spokesperson for college basketball players. And I came away just incredibly enthusiastic about what could happen if college basketball players had a legitimate body that was advocating for their own interest. And so I think even Coach K was there, and we can even, I'm going to try and dig up the quote, but when the media went to him, he's like, they being the NCAA and the members, better pay attention to what this group is doing, because they know what's going on. They're organizing. It was actually funded by the NABC, the National Association of Basketball Coaches. So the NCAA I mean, they a little shady in this regard. So what they did, instead of saying like, let's work with you, let's sit down at the proverbial bargaining table and come up with more fair rules. Shane Battier had expressed the idea that there was this whole concept of guilty till proven innocent. That athletes provide greater benefits that they're not participating in. And so they'd ask Coach K his opinion. He's like, well, the NCAA better pay attention to what this group is saying, because they will be an important force going forward. Why weren't they an important force going forward? Because the NCAA, instead of saying, okay, we're going to listen to them, they determined, because the NABC had paid for 20 college basketball players to fly to Indianapolis. They put them up at a hotel. They fed them. The NCAA determined, and this is 2001, that it was an extra benefit. There was no real social media to put this out there. And we would, have jumped on an opportunity like this. And that was pretty much the end of the student basketball committee. I've been involved in some efforts along the way to bring back another iteration of that, but we'll see. I mean, again, I think that there are a lot of really good people out there that want to amplify athlete rights at all levels. I mean, I think that there's so much more commonality and strength in numbers than having to say that this is male versus female, revenue versus non-revenue. I think that the NCAA has always trafficked in the whole idea that they could get spokespeople that would, within their group called the Student Athlete Advisory Committee, that were pre-selected based on who was most likely to drink the Kool-Aid. And so the people who I talked to weren't necessarily representative of the Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So look, I think that what's great about social media, about the lawsuits, about the idea that NIL has now created a system where athletes are much more knowledgeable, they're much more empowered, they have this platform that in the past they never had. And so I think that creates a climate where the time is right, where you better listen to them, you better sit down, because I think that the outcomes are going to be far worse if you just take that 115-year view of paternalistically, we know what's best, and back to shut up and dribble. And I think that these are exciting times. We certainly have a long way to go from NIL 1.0 to where it ultimately lands on. And I think that it was always easier for the NCAA just to never open that window up at all, because now the athletes are coming through.
We have officially arrived at the end of the show, but before we go, we have this tradition where we do our College Football Today takeaway, which is just maybe something that you learned on today's show. So I'm going to let our guest go first. Mark, what's your final takeaway from today?
My final takeaway is just, I love the fact that I used to say certain things like this that would get me kicked out of rooms, that would get, I wrote an op-ed once in the New York Times advocating for athletes, and then the NCAA president, not the one that just was thankfully ousted, but the one before. And, it was just this whole idea that you couldn't speak about athletes' rights because you didn't know what you were talking about. You weren't really educated. And the same things that I was saying 20 years ago are now getting me invited to teach about NIL, teach about athlete empowerment, financial education. So I think it's exciting, and we'll see where ultimately it lands. But just the idea to have platforms like this and athletes who can listen in and hopefully recognize that there's a knowledge base that can help them during their athletic career and beyond. I think that's something that we didn't even get into, of just how NIL can be used as a great internship to be able to get experience that they were previously prohibited from obtaining. So I don't know, I feel like we're scratching the surface, but almost like the Seinfeld line of just, sometimes you got to end it with the audience wanting more, but I appreciate the opportunity to come on for a little bit.
I love it. We loved having you. Carl, what's your final takeaway?
My final takeaway today is that even though we've made a lot of distance in terms of guys now starting to be able to get paid through NIL, we still have a long way to go in the overall structure of what's going on with the NCAA and how we handle the athletes totally. And athletes also need to understand that although they don't have all the avocation that they want from other people, they need to be responsible for their own representation. They need to be responsible for their legal team, their finances. They need to make sure that they have the people in place, that they study, that they meet, that they get sound advice from reputable people so their career doesn't come off the rails off the field.
Well said. My final takeaway is if this stuff seems complicated and confusing to you, imagine what it feels like for the student athlete. I mean, I think that my joke did not land and that I was part of a revenue generating sport in women's soccer. That was completely a joke. I do not think that like, my jersey would have sold out or anything. But through that experience, guys, I used to be terrified of the NCAA. I thought that one wrong move and I would make my entire team ineligible and we wouldn't be able to play anymore and I'd lose my scholarship. I mean, that's the way it's presented, is there's so many of these little ticky-tack rules that as student athletes, I mean, you're going to college for the first time. You're learning so much. You're meeting new teammates. You're trying to figure out, you know, how to play your sport at the collegiate level. And so much of the education that goes on is through compliance and making sure that you're doing everything that you're supposed to do. I mean, I have a personal experience of getting in trouble through the NCAA because on my unofficial visit, somebody picked up my meal. I had to donate the cost of a bowl of pasta in order to be square with the NCAA. I mean, there's things like that it is so incredibly complicated. And so what you're doing, Mark, is super important. I feel like Carl and I each saved like $15,000 since we don't have to enroll at USC. We got to just take the free course from you today. But this stuff is incredibly complicated. And so think of those student athletes as they deal with the changing times. And I do appreciate you helping out the student athlete, Mark. I know that I feel bad saying that word. It just, or that that phrase. I know that you don't like it, but that's essentially how they're viewed. But thank you for everything that you're doing for them. Thanks for coming on our show. We do appreciate it. But before I want to say goodbye, we do have tons of content going on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. If you haven't already checked out our college football recruiting show, be sure to do that. It is every Tuesday and Thursday at 5 o'clock. Again, that is right here on the 24/7 Sports YouTube channel. Mark, thank you. Carl, thank you. Viewers, thank you. Everybody, have a great rest of your week.
Thanks for having me. This is great.